On Easter Sunday 2022, 14-year-old Justin Westerfield methodically executed his parents, James Westerfield and Emily Westerfield, as they slept in their suburban Kansas City, Missouri home. The brutal double homicide sent shockwaves through the tight-knit law enforcement community where Officer Westerfield had served for 13 years, and the social services network where Emily had dedicated her career to protecting vulnerable children. Justin used his father's own hunting rifle, first shooting his father with deadly precision to the head before turning the weapon on his mother when she awakened to the sound of the first gunshot. What initially appeared to be a tragic home invasion quickly became something far more disturbing as investigators pieced together the events of that blood-soaked holiday morning. Before we continue with this shocking case, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now, let's return to the horrifying events that unfolded in what neighbors described as a perfect family home in Kansas City's Brookside neighborhood. The Westerfield family home sat on a tree-lined street of well-maintained bungalows, the kind of middle-class neighborhood that represented the steady, reliable character of Kansas City itself. Their two-story craftsman house, with its American flag hanging proudly by the front door and Officer Westerfield's police cruiser often parked in the driveway, had always symbolized safety and protection to neighbors. Easter decorations still adorned the front porch on that Sunday morning, colorful eggs hanging from the small ornamental tree and a cheerful bunny-shaped wreath on the front door, creating a macabre contrast to the horror scene inside. Behind that festive facade, Justin Westerfield had transformed the family home into a gruesome crime scene, one that would haunt first responders, many of whom personally knew his father, for years to come. The timeline pieced together by investigators would reveal that Justin had waited until approximately 5:30 a.m., a time when he knew both parents would be in their deepest sleep cycle. The teen had methodically retrieved his father's prized hunting rifle from the locked gun cabinet using a key he had secretly duplicated weeks earlier, demonstrating a level of planning rarely seen in juvenile offenders. Justin crept into his parents' bedroom on the second floor, standing at the foot of their bed for what crime scene analysts would later estimate was several minutes, perhaps steeling his resolve or savoring the moment of power he held over his sleeping parents. The first shot, fired at near point-blank range, struck James Westerfield directly in the forehead, killing him instantly and spattering blood across the white pillowcase and headboard of the marital bed. The loud crack of the high-powered rifle in the enclosed space of the bedroom instantly woke Emily Westerfield, who, according to forensic analysis of the scene, had only seconds to register what was happening before facing her son. Mom started screaming Dad's name and then saw me with a gun, Justin would later tell detectives with disturbing calmness during his confession. Emily had just enough time to raise her hands defensively and cry out, "Justin, no!" before her son fired the second shot, striking her in the chest and silencing her pleas permanently. According to the medical examiner's report, Emily Westerfield did not die immediately but bled out over several minutes, while her son watched from the doorway, making no attempt to summon help or ease her suffering as she gasped for breath on the blood-soaked bedsheets that April morning. Kansas City's eastern neighborhoods were just beginning to stir for Easter Sunday celebrations when Justin Westerfield finally called 911 at 6:42 a.m., over an hour after shooting his parents. The recording of that call would later be played in court, revealing a performance that initially fooled the dispatcher but would soon unravel under scrutiny. "Someone broke into our house," Justin said, his voice cracking with what seemed like genuine distress. "My parents, they're both shot. There's blood everywhere. I was hiding in my closet. I think the person is gone now." The teen's acting skills were impressive enough that the first responding officers approached the scene as an active home invasion, with Justin playing the role of traumatized survivor so convincingly that the officers initially wrapped him in a shock blanket and separated him from the scene to protect him from further trauma. The Westerfield home quickly transformed from a crime scene to a law enforcement gathering point as word spread that one of their own had fallen. Within hours, dozens of Kansas City Police Department officers had gathered outside the yellow crime scene tape, many openly weeping for their fallen colleague, while others stood in stoic silence, their faces masks of contained rage at the violation of one of the force's most respected families. Inside the home, as crime scene technicians methodically documented the gruesome bedroom scene, the first inconsistencies in Justin's story began to emerge. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing appeared to be stolen, and most damningly, Justin's description of hearing the intruder break in through the kitchen door contradicted the home's undisturbed security system log, which showed no entries or exits, except when emergency responders arrived. By mid-morning, as Easter services commenced across Kansas City, and families gathered for celebratory brunches, Detective Ryan Anderson of the KCPD Homicide Division was already developing doubts about the teenager's story. The position of the bodies, the angle of the shots, and the weapon itself, taken from the family's locked gun cabinet, all suggested an inside job. Something felt off from the moment I walked in, Detective Anderson would later testify. The scene was too controlled, too precise for a random home invasion. And there was Justin, who seemed to be cycling through emotions rather than genuinely experiencing them. He'd cry when someone was watching, then his face would go blank when he thought no one was looking. These subtle behavioral inconsistencies, combined with the physical evidence at the scene, would soon shift the investigation's focus from an unknown intruder to the victim's only child. The Easter Sunday that had begun with the celebration of resurrection for many Kansas City families had transformed into a day of inconceivable loss for the Westerfield family's extended network of colleagues, friends, and community members who had respected James and Emily. By nightfall, as news of the double homicide spread across local media, a candlelight vigil had formed spontaneously outside the Kansas City Police Department's Central Precinct. Dozens, then hundreds of community members gathered, holding flickering lights in the spring darkness to honor Officer Westerfield and his wife. Few among them could imagine that within 72 hours, the narrative would transform completely, with the victim's only child moving from traumatized survivor to prime suspect in one of the most shocking cases of familicide that Missouri had ever seen. James Westerfield had joined the Kansas City Police Department 13 years earlier after serving 4 years in the Marine Corps, bringing with him a disciplined approach to law enforcement and a deep commitment to community policing. Colleagues described him as old school in his dedication to the job, but progressive in his approach, believing that building relationships within the community was more effective than confrontational policing tactics. His commander, Captain Michael Harrison, would later eulogize him as the kind of officer who knew the names of every business owner, school teacher, and troubled kid on his beat. James had received 3 commendations for bravery during his career, including one for rushing into a burning apartment building to rescue an elderly resident, sustaining smoke inhalation injuries that hospitalized him for 3 days. His service record painted a picture of a dedicated officer who viewed his badge as a responsibility rather than an authority, making his murder at the hands of his own son all the more incomprehensible to those who had worked alongside him. Emily Westerfield had met James during her 2nd year as a social worker when they both responded to a domestic violence call involving a child at risk. Their colleagues would later recall how their professional relationship had quickly blossomed into romance, with Emily often bringing lunch to James at the precinct or James stopping by the family services office with coffee after his shift. As a licensed clinical social worker specializing in child trauma and family intervention, Emily had developed a reputation throughout Kansas City's social services network as a fierce advocate who would work tirelessly for the children in her caseload. Emily was the social worker other social workers called when they had a particularly difficult case, her supervisor at Jackson County Family Services would testify during the trial. She somehow managed to maintain both boundaries and deep compassion, which is the hardest balance to strike in this profession. Emily's colleagues described her as methodical in her documentation, unflinching when confronting abusive parents, and remarkably skilled at gaining the trust of traumatized children. Together, James and Emily Westerfield represented a powerful force for good in Kansas City, their complementary professions allowing them to approach community problems from both law enforcement and social welfare perspectives. They had met when James was 24 and Emily was 23, marrying 2 years later and welcoming Justin into their lives when they were both 28. Photos displayed at the funeral showed a seemingly picture-perfect family. James in his dress uniform, Emily with her warm smile, and Justin growing from a chubby-cheeked toddler to a handsome teenage boy who had inherited his father's strong jaw and his mother's expressive eyes. Holiday cards sent to colleagues over the years portrayed them camping, at baseball games, and celebrating birthdays. Normal, happy family moments that made the Easter Sunday massacre all the more shocking. Friends and family would later struggle to reconcile the smiling boy in those photographs with the cold-blooded killer who had methodically executed his parents as they slept. The Westerfield home reflected the couple's dedication to creating a stable, nurturing environment for their son, with Justin's academic achievements prominently displayed on the refrigerator and family photos lining the hallway walls. Emily had painted Justin's bedroom in Kansas City Chiefs colors when he was 10, and James had built the custom desk where Justin studied, maintaining honor roll grades until his recent academic decline in the months before the murders. Neighbors described how James had coached Justin's Little League team for years, and Emily had volunteered at every school function, from bake sales to career days, where she would sensitively explain her work helping children in crisis. The Westerfields' home had been the site of neighborhood barbecues in summer and holiday gatherings in winter, with Emily known for her legendary pecan pie, and James for his perfectly grilled steaks. The violent end to their lives created a painful cognitive dissonance for everyone who had known them. How could such caring parents raise a child capable of such calculated violence? The double funeral held the week after the murders drew over 500 attendees, including the entire shift of officers who had worked with James, dozens of social workers who had collaborated with Emily, and scores of community members whose lives had been touched by one or both. Westerfields. The Kansas City Police Department provided a full honor guard for James with a solemn procession of patrol cars, officers in dress uniforms, and the ceremonial folding of the American flag presented to James's mother. Emily's colleagues created a memorial fund in her name to provide emergency assistance to children in crisis, honoring her life's work even as they mourned her death. Conspicuously absent from the funeral was Justin Westerfield, who by then was in juvenile detention, his absence creating an uncomfortable void at the center of the memorial service. Pastor Robert Jenkins, who had baptized Justin as an infant, struggled to find words that could comfort the mourners without directly addressing the unimaginable betrayal that had shattered the Westerfield family. We gather today not to understand, for some things defy human understanding, but to honor 2 lives of service and love, he told the overflowing church. James and Emily Westerfield devoted themselves to protecting the vulnerable and building a safer community for all of us. As the investigation progressed, interviews with the Westerfields' colleagues revealed a more nuanced picture of their family life, particularly in the months leading up to the murders. Several of Emily's fellow social workers noted that she had seemed increasingly stressed and had sought advice about dealing with a rebellious teenager. Emily confided that Justin had been pushing boundaries hard, recalled Dana Mitchell, a close colleague. She was concerned about his new friend group and some behavioral changes, but she believed they were handling it appropriately with clear consequences and open communication. James's partner on the force, Officer Thomas Reynolds, similarly reported that James had recently expressed frustration about Justin's attitude. James told me that Justin had been caught lying about where he'd been one weekend, and they'd taken away his phone privileges and computer access except for schoolwork, Officer Reynolds stated in his witness testimony. James said Justin had erupted into a rage unlike anything they'd seen from him before, screaming that they were ruining his life and that he hated them. The picture that emerged from these testimonials was not of abusive or neglectful parents, but rather of devoted, albeit strict parents, attempting to navigate the turbulent waters of adolescence with their increasingly defiant son. Text messages recovered from Emily's phone revealed her reaching out to other parents and child development experts, seeking advice on appropriate boundaries for a 14-year-old. "We're trying to balance giving him independence while still keeping him safe," she had written to a colleague just 3 weeks before her death. "James tends to be a bit more rigid because of what he sees on the job, and I sometimes worry that's making Justin rebel more." These insights into the family dynamics would later be used by both prosecution and defense. During the trial, the prosecution painting a picture of parents doing their best with a dangerously entitled child, while the defense suggesting that the strict household had created pressure that contributed to Justin's mental state. James and Emily Westerfield died at the ages of 42 and 41, respectively, their lives of public service cut short in an act of domestic violence that was particularly painful, given Emily's professional focus on family trauma. The tragic irony that Emily had dedicated her career to protecting children from dangerous home environments only to be killed by her own child was not lost on her colleagues at Jackson County Family Services. Emily would have been the first person called to help a family in crisis like this if it had been anyone else, her supervisor noted with bitter sadness. She would have seen the warning signs, would have known exactly what resources to connect them with. Instead, Emily and James Westerfield became statistics in the rare but devastating category of parents murdered by their children, their lives of service overshadowed by the shocking nature of their deaths and the subsequent media attention focused on their son's trial. The first officers to arrive at the Westerfield home at 6:47 a.m. on Easter Sunday were responding to what dispatch had coded as a possible home invasion with 2 victims down and a juvenile witness on scene. Officer Rebecca Chen and her partner, Officer Mark Thompson, approached the residence with weapons drawn, following protocol for an active crime scene where a suspect might still be present. When we entered, Justin Westerfield was sitting on the bottom stair of the staircase, rocking slightly with his head in his hands, Officer Chen would later testify. He looked up at us with this expression that I initially read as shock, but later came to question. The officers secured the lower level before proceeding upstairs, where they discovered the bodies of James and Emily Westerfield in their bed, the sheets soaked with blood that had already begun to dry at the edges. Officer Chen, upon recognizing James Westerfield as a fellow officer, had to step outside momentarily to compose herself while Officer Thompson radioed for additional units and crime scene technicians, his voice breaking as he confirmed the identity of one victim as an officer of the Kansas City Police Department. The bustling Kansas City neighborhood of Brookside awoke to the jarring sight of police cruisers lining their normally peaceful street, lights flashing against the early morning Easter decorations many families had placed in their front yards. Neighbors in bathrobes and pajamas gathered behind the hastily established police perimeter, many clutching coffee cups and exchanging shocked whispers as news of the Westerfield murders spread from house to house. "It just doesn't happen here," one elderly neighbor told local news crews that would soon arrive to broadcast the tragedy to the wider Missouri community. And not to people like the Westerfields. James was a police officer, for God's sake. The juxtaposition of Easter Sunday's celebration of life against the violent deaths of two respected community members created a surreal atmosphere that clung to the investigation from its earliest moments, with first responders moving through their protocols while visibly struggling with their emotional responses to the scene. Detective Ryan Anderson arrived at 7:22 a.m. and immediately recognized the critical importance of this case. Not only was a fellow officer dead, but the initial report of a home invasion in one of Kansas City's safer neighborhoods would trigger widespread community fear. Anderson, a 15-year veteran of the Homicide Division with a reputation for methodical thoroughness, began by isolating Justin Westerfield in a patrol car for what he termed a witness protection interview rather than an interrogation, carefully maintaining the teenager's witness status while observing his behavior and statements. One of the first red flags was how Justin kept using past tense to describe his parents before he supposedly knew they were dead, Detective Anderson noted in his case file. He said, "My dad was a police officer and my mom was a social worker," even though at that point we had deliberately not confirmed to him that both victims were deceased. This subtle linguistic slip became the first in a series of inconsistencies that would gradually shift the investigation's direction toward the victim's son. The crime scene told a story that contradicted Justin's initial statement about hiding in his closet after hearing an intruder. Crime scene technician Sofia Rodriguez meticulously documented the undisturbed dust patterns on the windowsills, the functioning alarm system that showed no breaches, and the lack of any evidence supporting an outside entry. The gun cabinet in the den had been opened with a key, not forced, Rodriguez would later testify. The rifle was found on the bedroom floor near the foot of the bed, and gunshot residue tests indicated the shooter had fired from a position directly at the foot of the bed, approximately 5 feet from the victims. Most tellingly, Rodriguez discovered Justin's fingerprints on the ammunition box in the cabinet, fresh prints that suggested recent handling, though Justin had claimed not to have touched his father's guns in at least a year. The methodical processing of the scene gradually built a physical narrative that aligned less with a home invasion and more with an inside job, though investigators were initially reluctant to fully confront the implication that a 14-year-old had murdered his parents. While the technical processing of the crime scene continued upstairs, Detective Anderson conducted a walkthrough of the rest of the Westerfield home, noting details that seemed incongruous with Justin's story. The kitchen, where Justin claimed to have heard the intruder enter, showed no signs of disturbance. Dishes from the previous evening's dinner were still neatly stacked in the drying rack. The deadbolt was engaged from the inside, and the cookie jar, where James Westerfield had always kept the house's spare key, remained undisturbed. In Justin's bedroom, Anderson observed the carefully made bed that suggested it hadn't been slept in, contradicting the teen's claim that he had been awakened by noises. The room was unusually tidy for a 14-year-old boy, Anderson reported. No clothes on the floor, bed perfectly made with hospital corners, school books aligned on the desk. It had the appearance of being deliberately organized rather than naturally lived in. This observation would later gain significance when prosecutors suggested Justin had cleaned his room as part of his preparation for the murders, a final act of organization before violently reshaping his life. The breakthrough in the investigation came when crime scene technicians discovered an empty box of ammunition in James Westerfield's gun cabinet that corresponded exactly to the caliber and brand used in the murders. The box bore a price sticker from Heartland Hunting Supplies, a sporting goods store located approximately 3 miles from the Westerfield home. The box caught my attention because it was the only one that was completely empty, explained forensic technician Marcus Green. Other boxes of ammunition in the cabinet were either full or partially used, but this particular box had been completely emptied and then returned to the cabinet. When Green examined the box more closely, he discovered a receipt crumpled at the bottom, dated March 17, 2022, exactly 3 weeks before the murders. The name on the credit card slip was James Westerfield, but the signature bore little resemblance to exemplars of Officer Westerfield's handwriting obtained from police department records, raising immediate questions about who had actually purchased the ammunition. Detectives quickly secured security footage from Heartland Hunting Supplies, reviewing the recordings from March 17th with the store's owner, Victor Ramirez. "We maintain 30 days of video as standard practice," Ramirez explained when he provided the footage to investigators. "Our store policy is to check ID for all ammunition purchases, regardless of the customer's age, and to make a copy of that ID for our records." The footage clearly showed a young white male purchasing the ammunition at 4:27 p.m. on March 17th, presenting what appeared to be identification to the clerk. When detectives compared the grainy image from the security camera with recent school photographs of Justin Westerfield, the resemblance was unmistakable despite the baseball cap pulled low over the customer's face. The store's records included a photocopy of the ID presented, a driver's license in James Westerfield's name, but with a photo that had been subtly altered to make the subject appear older than Justin but younger than the 42-year-old James, a sophisticated forgery that had successfully fooled the young clerk working that afternoon. The discovery of the ammunition purchase formed the foundation of what Detective Anderson termed the smoking gun that led to the shooter in his final case report. With this concrete evidence in hand, Anderson shifted the investigation's focus from a possible home invasion to a thorough examination of Justin Westerfield's activities in the weeks leading up to the murders. Search warrants were obtained for Justin's phone, computer, and social media accounts, revealing a digital trail that contradicted the image of the bereaved son he had presented to first responders. We found multiple searches for phrases like how to make a fake ID, perfect murder planning, and can minors inherit money if parents die? Digital forensics expert Aidan Morris reported after analyzing Justin's devices. These searches dated back approximately 2 months before the murders and increased in frequency in the weeks leading up to Easter Sunday. The digital evidence, combined with the ammunition purchase, transformed what had initially seemed unthinkable, that a 14-year-old honor student had executed his parents, into an investigative certainty that demanded immediate action. 48 hours after the murders, Detective Anderson made the difficult decision to formally consider Justin Westerfield a suspect rather than a witness. The teenager had been staying with his maternal grandparents, Martha and Richard Barnett, who had steadfastly defended their grandson against growing community whispers about his possible involvement. They couldn't conceive that Justin would harm his parents, Anderson recalled of his conversation with the Barnetts when he arrived at their home with a juvenile detention order. Mrs. Barnett actually collapsed when I explained why we were taking Justin into custody. It was one of the hardest moments in my career, watching those grandparents process a second trauma after already losing their daughter. Justin himself showed surprisingly little emotion when detectives arrived, asking only if he could bring his phone, which was denied, and whether the juvenile detention center had Wi-Fi. It did not. This affect, described by multiple officers as inappropriately flat, given the circumstances, would later feature prominently in psychological evaluations introduced during his trial. As Justin Westerfield was processed into the Jackson County Juvenile Detention Center on suspicion of 2 counts of first-degree murder, the investigation continued to build its case around the foundational clue of the ammunition purchase. Detectives interviewed Justin's teachers, classmates, and the parents of his friends, developing a picture of a teenager who had become increasingly secretive and resentful of his parents' rules in recent months. "Justin told me his parents were suffocating him," reported Tyler Jenkins, identified as one of Justin's closest friends. "He said they wouldn't let him go to parties or spend his money how he wanted. About a month ago, he said something like, 'I'll be free soon,' but I thought he just meant when he turned 16 and could get his driver's license." Other classmates described Justin bragging about parties he planned to throw once he had his own place, though he had been vague about how a 14-year-old planned to acquire independent housing. The physical evidence, digital footprint, witness statements, and ammunition purchase using a fake ID collectively built a case that pointed definitively toward Justin Westerfield as the perpetrator of a premeditated double homicide. What remained unclear in those early investigative days was the depth of the motive. Why a teenager from a stable home with no prior history of violence would execute such a calculated plan against the parents who, by all accounts, had provided him with a loving, if structured, upbringing. Sometimes in homicide, the why is as important as the who and the how, Detective Anderson observed in his case notes. With Justin Westerfield, we had solid evidence for the who and the how, but the why seemed disproportionate. Trading 2 human lives for more social freedom and spending money seemed like such an extreme equation that we kept looking for something else, some deeper trauma or trigger we might have missed. This search for comprehensible motivation would continue throughout the investigation and trial, though the foundational evidence of the ammunition purchase had already laid the groundwork for what prosecutors would later call one of the most clear-cut cases of juvenile premeditated murder in Missouri history. The security footage from Heartland Hunting Supplies became the linchpin of the case against Justin Westerfield, revealing a level of premeditation that shocked even veteran investigators on the case. Enhanced by the FBI's Forensic Video Unit in Kansas City, the footage clearly showed Justin entering the store at 4:22 p.m. on March 17th, wearing his father's Kansas City Royals baseball cap pulled low and a jacket that appeared too large for his frame, later identified as one of James Westerfield's windbreakers. The suspect deliberately selected this outfit to reinforce the idea that he was James Westerfield, FBI video analyst Teresa Hammond explained in her report. He even adopted a more mature walking gait, with squared shoulders and slower, deliberate steps that mimicked an adult male's movement patterns. The teenager browsed the fishing section for approximately 7 minutes, seemingly killing time while observing the checkout counters, before finally approaching the ammunition display at 4:29 p.m., when the store's more experienced manager had stepped away for a break, leaving a younger employee manning the register. The footage captured Justin selecting the exact ammunition that matched his father's hunting rifle, a .30-06 Springfield, cartridge specifically designed for big game hunting with maximum stopping power. Store clerk Braden Murphy, just 19 years old and working at Heartland Hunting Supplies for less than a month at the time, recalled the transaction during his police interview. He seemed nervous, which I thought was weird, but he had ID and looked old enough, Murphy stated. When I asked what he was hunting, he said, "Deer season's coming up," even though it was March, and deer season wasn't until November. I remember thinking that was odd, but he had Officer Westerfield's credit card and ID, so I just assumed he knew what he was doing. The clerk's failure to recognize discrepancies between the ID photo and the customer standing before him would later become a training example in the store's revised security protocols, though Murphy's supervisor emphasized that the forgery was sophisticated enough that many adults might have been similarly fooled. Forensic document examiner Dr. Elaine Peterson, who analyzed the fake ID used in the purchase, described it as remarkably sophisticated for a creation by a 14-year-old. The forgery had been created by digitally altering a photograph of Justin to make him appear older, darkening his jawline to suggest stubble, subtly reshaping his features to harden them, and adding slight creasing around the eyes that suggested maturity. This was not a crude cut-and-paste job, Dr. Peterson testified. The alterations were skillful enough that they would pass casual inspection, especially when presented confidently by someone who otherwise seemed legitimate. The investigation revealed that Justin had used school library computers to research ID forgery techniques, carefully deleting his browsing history afterward, but leaving digital fingerprints that forensic technicians were able to recover. The images themselves had been printed on high-quality photo paper using the color printer at a local copy shop, where Justin had paid cash and avoided the security cameras by having a homeless man he'd paid $20 make the actual transaction. As investigators dug deeper into Justin's activities in the weeks before the murder, they discovered he had conducted a practice run of purchasing items with his father's credit card at a mall in neighboring Independence, Missouri. Security footage from a sporting goods store there showed Justin successfully buying a pair of expensive sneakers using the same fake ID and his father's credit card 2 days before the ammunition purchase. He was testing the system, Detective Anderson explained, during a case briefing with the prosecutor's office. He wanted to see if his fake ID would work for a routine purchase before risking using it for something as suspicious as ammunition. The transaction had gone unnoticed by James Westerfield because Justin had intercepted the credit card statement when it arrived in the mail, another demonstration of his methodical planning. The sneakers themselves were found, hidden in Justin's bedroom closet, still in their box with the receipt tucked inside, physical evidence that further connected him to both the ID forgery and the ammunition purchase methodology. Interviews with Justin's classmates at Pembroke Hill School, an exclusive private institution where the Westerfields had sent their son despite the financial strain on their public servants' salaries, revealed a teenager increasingly obsessed with wealth and social status. Justin was always talking about how his parents were holding him back, said classmate Emma Richardson. He'd show us websites of expensive clothes he wanted, and parties at clubs he said he'd throw once he came into some money. We thought he was just fantasizing. Another student, Noah Campbell, described an incident in February when Justin had shown several boys a flask of whiskey he'd stolen from his father's liquor cabinet. He said he was planning a huge party for spring break, but his parents said he couldn't go to Florida with some of the other guys. He got really intense about it, saying, "They won't be an issue much longer," in this weird, cold voice that gave me chills. These statements, initially overlooked as typical teenage hyperbole, gained sinister significance when viewed through the lens of the Easter Sunday murders. Justin's digital footprint provided investigators with a disturbing window into his escalating determination to eliminate his parents. His search history revealed queries for poisons that look like natural death, how to silence a gun, and do parents' assets automatically go to children in the weeks leading up to the ammunition purchase. After acquiring the ammunition, his searches became more focused on practical aspects of his plan, including how long does a body stay warm after death, best time to commit murder without witnesses, and how to stage a crime scene. The teenager had also visited numerous real estate websites, browsing luxury condominiums in Kansas City's upscale Plaza District and saving listings for properties valued at over $500,000. He wasn't just fantasizing about freedom in some abstract sense, digital forensics expert Aidan Morris explained. He was actively planning how he would spend his inheritance after killing his parents. He had even started drafting a shopping list that included a Rolex watch, designer clothes, and a Corvette. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a carefully hidden journal in a waterproof container buried beneath the shed in the Westerfields' backyard. Cadaver dogs brought in to search the property for any additional evidence had alerted handlers to the disturbed earth where Justin had buried his written plans approximately 2 inches below the surface. The journal, recovered intact by crime scene technicians, contained detailed notes on his parents' sleep schedules, observations about which floorboards creaked in the hallway outside their bedroom, and multiple drafted versions of what he would tell police after the murders. Intruder Narrative Version 3. I was asleep but heard a noise downstairs around 5 a.m., one entry read. I hid in my closet and heard 2 gunshots. I was too scared to come out until I was sure they were gone. Around 6:30, I didn't see their face. They might have been wearing a mask. This journal, with its cold calculation and alternate versions of his planned alibi, became what prosecutor Victoria Palmer would later call the most damning evidence of premeditation I've seen in 20 years of prosecuting homicide cases. As the evidence mounted against Justin, investigators turned their attention to understanding the home environment that had produced such a calculating young killer. Contrary to the defense team's later claims of abuse or neglect, interviews with family friends, neighbors, and school officials painted a picture of James and Emily Westerfield as devoted but appropriately strict parents. They had rules, sure, but nothing unusual, noted Justin's 7th-grade teacher, Diane Matthews. No phone at the dinner table, homework before video games, curfews appropriate to his age, basic structure that most parents try to provide. Several witnesses described recent conflicts over Justin's desire to attend unchaperoned parties with older teenagers and his parents' refusal to increase his $25 weekly allowance to the $100 he had demanded. Justin's maternal grandmother, still reeling from her daughter's murder, reluctantly shared that Emily had recently discovered vape pens in Justin's room and had grounded him for 2 weeks, a punishment that was still in effect during the Easter weekend of the murders. The Kansas City juvenile justice system, faced with the gravity of the crimes and the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, made the rare decision to certify Justin Westerfield to stand trial as an adult despite his age. Judge Harold Zimmerman, after reviewing the evidence of the ammunition purchase and the journal detailing his murder plans, stated that the case represented the very definition of the extraordinary circumstances under which a juvenile should be tried as an adult. In his certification ruling, Judge Zimmerman specifically cited the ammunition purchase as evidence that this was not a crime of passion or momentary impulse, but rather a coldly calculated execution that demonstrates both an adult capacity to plan and an adult understanding of consequences. The decision to try Justin as an adult meant that, if convicted, he could face a much more severe sentence than would be possible in the juvenile system, potentially including life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The Westerfield case quickly gained national attention, with media outlets descending on Kansas City to report on what many called a perfect storm case of juvenile crime. A teenager from a good home with no previous criminal record who had meticulously planned and executed the murder of his parents for what appeared to be the shockingly mundane motive of greater social and financial freedom. The case raised uncomfortable questions about adolescent brain development, parental authority in the digital age, and the growing sense of entitlement that some commentators attributed to Justin's generation. What makes the Westerfield case so disturbing is that there's no obvious explanation, noted criminal psychologist Dr. Rebecca Torres in a national news interview. No history of abuse, no documented mental illness, no traumatic triggering event, just a teenager who decided his parents' rules were too restrictive and that murder was an acceptable solution to that problem. As Justin Westerfield awaited trial in an adult detention facility, segregated from other inmates due to his age, Kansas City residents struggled to comprehend how the son of a respected police officer and a dedicated social worker could have betrayed the very values his parents had spent their lives upholding. The forensic analysis of the ammunition proved to be the scientific cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Justin Westerfield. Ballistics expert Dr. Marcus Reed conducted detailed comparisons between the spent shell casings found at the crime scene and the unfired rounds from the same batch purchased at Heartland Hunting Supplies. Each manufacturing batch of ammunition carries microscopic identifying characteristics, Dr. Reed explained in his formal report. The ammunition used in the Westerfield murders came from lot number RK47203, which matches precisely with the lot number on the empty box found in James Westerfield's gun cabinet and on the receipt from the March 17th purchase. This conclusion eliminated any possibility that the killer had used older ammunition already present in the Westerfield home, directly connecting the premeditated purchase to the actual murder weapon. The precision of this forensic link transformed the ammunition purchase from merely suspicious behavior into a crucial evidentiary pillar that demonstrated Justin's advanced planning and intent. The financial aspect of Justin's motive became increasingly clear as prosecutors subpoenaed the Westerfield's life insurance policies, property records, and investment accounts. Assistant District Attorney Caroline Bennett, assigned to support lead prosecutor Victoria Palmer on the case, assembled a comprehensive picture of the Westerfield family's finances that revealed James and Emily had maintained modest but stable assets that would have transferred to Justin upon their deaths. The combined life insurance policies totaled $750,000, the home equity was approximately $320,000, and retirement accounts added another $410,000, Bennett documented in her financial analysis. For a 14-year-old with expensive tastes, the nearly $1.5 million total would have seemed like an unlimited fortune. Investigators discovered that Justin had actually taken screenshots of his father's financial statements when James had briefly left his laptop open one evening, storing these images in a password-protected folder labeled Future Plans on his own computer, further evidencing his awareness of the financial benefit he stood to gain from his parents' deaths. Digital forensic analysis of Justin's devices revealed that his planning extended beyond the physical preparation of acquiring the murder weapon's ammunition. Computer specialist Aaron Takahashi recovered a carefully constructed timeline found in Justin's cloud storage, detailing a post-murder plan that included 1. Call police 60, 90 minutes after to ensure no pulse. 2. Act shocked, traumatized during interview. 3. Stay with grandparents, max 2 weeks. 4. Push for control of assets through lawyer. 5. Move to Plaza Condo before next school year. This document had been created in February and modified multiple times, with the final edit occurring just 36 hours before the murders. What's particularly disturbing about this timeline is how realistic and practical it is, Takahashi noted in his testimony. There are no fantasy elements or grandiose plans, just a methodical step-by-step approach to transitioning from dependent child to wealthy independent teenager after eliminating his parents. The document included research on Missouri guardianship laws and notes about which family friend would likely be appointed his guardian, showing Justin had considered even the legal aftermath of his planned orphaning. The investigation into Justin's social media activity painted a troubling picture of a teenager who had become obsessed with a lifestyle his parents couldn't or wouldn't provide. In private messages to online friends, many of whom he had never met in person, Justin had crafted an alternate persona as Justin W., the son of a wealthy Kansas City business executive who had access to unlimited funds and complete social freedom. "My parents let me do whatever I want," he wrote to one online acquaintance 3 weeks before the murders. "They're going on a long trip soon, and I'll have the house to myself. Going to throw the biggest party KC has ever seen." In other messages, he had promised to fly friends to Miami on a private jet once my trust fund kicks in, creating an elaborate fiction about coming into significant wealth on his 15th birthday. which would have been 3 weeks after the murders. These digital breadcrumbs established not only Justin's dissatisfaction with his actual life circumstances, but also his detailed fantasy of the life he believed he would lead after his parents were gone. The evidence of Justin's deteriorating relationship with his parents grew as investigators interviewed extended family members who had observed recent interactions. Emily's sister, Catherine Barnett, provided particularly insightful testimony about an incident at a family dinner 2 weeks before the murders. Justin asked for permission to go to a concert with some older kids from school, and when Emily said no, he had this moment where his face just changed, Catherine recalled. It wasn't a normal teenage sulk or anger. His expression went completely cold, and he said, "You won't be able to control me forever." James told him to watch his tone, and Justin just stared at him with this look that gave me chills. At the time, I thought it was typical teenage rebellion, but looking back, it feels like he was already planning what he was going to do to them. Other relatives described similar incidents of Justin exhibiting what one uncle called a frightening stillness when denied permission or money for social activities. School counselor Margaret Chen provided prosecutors with notes from 3 sessions she had conducted with Justin in the months before the murders, sessions that had been initiated after several teachers reported concerning changes in his behavior. Justin expressed frustration that his parents were suffocating him and preventing him from living the life he deserved, Chen's notes indicated. When I suggested standard teenage parent compromises, he dismissed them as pointless because his parents would never change and never understand him. Most alarmingly, in their final session, just 10 days before the murders, Chen had documented Justin saying, "Sometimes I think about just making them disappear so I could live my own life." Following protocol, Chen had contacted Emily Westerfield about this statement, but Justin had quickly walked it back as just a joke and normal teenage venting. Emily, using her professional training as a social worker, had scheduled a family therapy appointment, which had been set for the Tuesday after Easter Sunday, 2 days after she and her husband would be murdered. The prosecution team, led by experienced homicide prosecutor Victoria Palmer, methodically assembled these evidence strands into a compelling narrative of a teenager consumed by material desires and social aspirations, who viewed his parents as obstacles to be eliminated rather than guides to be respected. The ammunition purchase is the smoking gun, quite literally, Palmer explained to her investigative team during a case preparation meeting. It proves planning, intent, and a clear understanding that what he was preparing to do was wrong. Otherwise, why the elaborate fake ID scheme? Palmer, known for her methodical approach to case construction, insisted on building multiple evidentiary pathways to conviction rather than relying solely on the ammunition purchase, creating what she called a fortress of evidence that included digital forensics, financial analysis, witness statements, and psychological assessments. This thorough approach would eventually prove crucial in overcoming the natural jury reluctance to convict such a young defendant of the most serious charges possible. The defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney Robert Mercado, recognized the overwhelming evidence against their client and pivoted toward a strategy that acknowledged Justin's actions while arguing for diminished capacity and mental health considerations. We had the difficult task of admitting that our client committed these acts while trying to explain the psychological context that led a 14-year-old to such an extreme solution, Mercado later wrote in a legal journal article about the case. The ammunition purchase made denying involvement impossible, so we focused instead on the developmental aspects, arguing that adolescent brain development, particularly in the areas governing impulse control and consequence assessment, should mitigate the charges. This strategy required extensive psychological evaluation of Justin, a process that revealed further disturbing insights into the teenager's mindset, but ultimately failed to identify any diagnosable mental illness that would support an insanity defense. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Wong conducted a series of evaluations with Justin while he awaited trial, producing a detailed report that prosecutors and defense attorneys would interpret in dramatically different ways. The subject demonstrates several concerning personality traits, including shallow affect, grandiose sense of self-worth, callousness, and lack of remorse, Dr. Wong wrote. However, he shows no evidence of psychosis, thought disorder, or intellectual impairment that would prevent him from understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. Dr. Wong noted that Justin spoke about his parents' deaths in detached, practical terms, focusing primarily on his frustration that his plans had been interrupted by his arrest. When asked directly about whether he felt remorse for killing his parents, Justin reportedly responded, "I guess I should have waited until I had my own place lined up first. That was a planning error." This lack of emotional connection to his actions or their impact on his victims became a central focus of the psychological testimony that would later be presented at trial. As the case against Justin Westerfield moved toward trial, the ammunition purchase remained the most concrete and damning piece of evidence, a physical, traceable action that connected his planning phase to the execution phase of the murders. Without that ammunition purchase, we might still be looking at a very strong circumstantial case, Detective Ryan Anderson reflected in an interview with the Kansas City Star. But that purchase means we don't have to rely on circumstantial evidence. We have direct proof of planning and intent that's nearly impossible to explain away. The empty ammunition box, the store receipt, the security footage, and the fake ID collectively formed an evidentiary chain that directly linked Justin Westerfield to a murder plot that had been in motion at least 3 weeks before he finally pulled the trigger on Easter Sunday morning, destroying 2 lives and irrevocably altering his own. As one juror would later comment, after the verdict, the ammunition purchase was the moment his thoughts became actions. That's when thinking about killing his parents became actually planning to kill them. And that's the moment he crossed the line into true premeditation. The formal arrest of Justin Westerfield occurred on April 10, 2022, 3 days after the murders, when Detective Ryan Anderson arrived at the Jackson County Juvenile Detention Center where Justin had been held since being taken into custody. "Justin Westerfield, you are under arrest for the murders of James Westerfield and Emily Westerfield," Anderson stated, reading the teenager his Miranda rights while juvenile corrections officers looked on. Justin's response was unnervingly calm, with officers noting he simply asked, "Can I have my phone back now?" seemingly more concerned about his device than the serious charges being leveled against him. When informed that he was being charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder, Justin showed his first sign of genuine emotion, not grief or remorse, but rather visible irritation, sighing heavily and muttering, "That's not fair," under his breath. This moment of frustration, captured on the detention center's security cameras, would later be played for the jury as evidence of the teenager's priorities and emotional responses at the time of his arrest. The interrogation room at Kansas City Police Headquarters, where Justin would spend the next 12 hours, was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. A small, windowless space with hard plastic chairs, bright fluorescent lighting, and a metal table bolted to the floor. Detective Anderson and his partner, Detective Sandra Martinez, employed a carefully planned strategy for the interrogation, beginning with building rapport through seemingly casual conversation, before gradually introducing the evidence against the teenager. We started by asking about his relationship with his parents, school life, friends, normal teenage topics, Detective Martinez recalled. Justin spoke easily about these things, presenting himself as a typical high-achieving student with strict but loving parents. There was a practiced quality to his responses, as if he'd rehearsed what a normal grieving son should say. During this initial phase, the detectives noted that Justin maintained consistent eye contact and spoke with a steady voice, showing none of the emotional volatility or distress typical of teenage suspects, especially those discussing recently murdered family members. 3 hours into the interrogation, after Justin had been provided with a meal and multiple bathroom breaks as required for juvenile suspects, the detectives shifted their approach by placing a sealed evidence bag containing the empty ammunition box on the table between them. "Do you recognize this?" Detective Anderson asked, his tone deliberately casual despite the critical nature of the question. Justin glanced at the box and shrugged. "It looks like ammunition for my dad's hunting rifle. He keeps stuff like that in his cabinet." When Anderson opened the evidence bag and removed the crumpled receipt from inside the box, Justin's composure showed its first crack, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes and a momentary freeze in his normally fluid movements. "This receipt shows this ammunition was purchased on March 17th at Heartland Hunting Supplies," Anderson continued, keeping his voice conversational. "Your father was working the afternoon shift that day. He couldn't have made this purchase." Justin maintained his denial, suggesting perhaps his father had sent someone else to buy it. But the confidence had drained from his voice, replaced by a defensive edge that the experienced interrogators immediately recognized as fear. The psychological turning point in the interrogation came when Detectives Anderson and Martinez played the enhanced security footage from Heartland Hunting Supplies, showing Justin clearly entering the store and making the purchase while wearing his father's jacket and cap. That's when his entire demeanor transformed, Detective Martinez later testified. He went from confident denial to calculating silence in the space of seconds. The detectives observed as Justin watched himself on the screen, his eyes darting between the footage and their faces, visibly assessing how much they knew and what his remaining options might be. When the footage ended, Justin sat in silence for nearly 4 minutes, a stretch of time that felt interminable in the small room, before finally saying, "I want to call my grandparents." This request for family contact, rather than legal representation, allowed the detectives to continue their questioning, a procedural detail that would later be unsuccessfully challenged by Justin's defense team during pre-trial motions. The tactical breakthrough came when detectives revealed they had recovered Justin's journal from beneath the shed, placing several photocopied pages on the table where the teenager could see his own handwriting detailing his murder plans. "You planned this carefully, Justin," Detective Anderson said, his tone shifting from interrogative to conversational, almost collegial. "The ammunition purchase, the fake ID, the journal, these aren't impulsive actions. You thought this through. What we don't understand is why. Help us understand why you felt you needed to do this." This approach, acknowledging the evidence was overwhelming, while offering Justin the opportunity to explain his reasoning, opened a flood of justification from the teenager. "You don't know what it was like living with them," Justin finally responded, his voice taking on an entitled edge that contradicted his previous presentation as a grieving son. "My dad was a cop, so he had all these rules, always checking my phone, making me tell him where I was going, who I was with. My mom was even worse, using her social worker skills to analyze everything I said. I couldn't breathe in that house." As the interrogation progressed into its 8th hour, Justin began speaking more freely about his frustrations, painting a picture not of abusive parents, but of a teenager who resented normal boundaries and supervision. "They wouldn't let me go to Cancun for spring break with Tyler's family, even though Tyler's parents said it was fine. They said I was too young," Justin complained, his voice rising with indignation. "They limited my allowance to $25 a week when everybody else at school gets hundreds. They checked my grades online every single day. When I wanted to stay out past 11 on weekends, my dad said that's when the trouble starts in this city, like I was going to get arrested or something, just for hanging out with my friends. With each example he provided, Justin's resentment became more palpable, his description of his parents' rules revealing not unusual strictness, but rather typical parental boundaries that he had found intolerable. The detectives deliberately showed no judgment during these statements, allowing Justin to continue building his own narrative of grievance and entitlement that would later prove devastating when played back for the jury. 9 hours into the interrogation, Detective Anderson directly confronted Justin with the essential question. "Justin, did you kill your parents?" After a brief pause, Justin looked directly at the detective and replied, "If they had just given me some freedom, none of this would have happened. It's kind of their fault if you think about it." This deflection of responsibility, while not a direct confession, was followed by increasingly explicit admissions, as the teenager apparently calculated that explaining his actions might somehow mitigate his culpability. "I didn't want to hurt them," he continued, though his journal entries clearly contradicted this claim. "I just wanted to be free to live how I want. Do you know how much money they had? All that money just sitting there while I couldn't even buy the clothes I wanted or go to the places everyone else was going. It wasn't fair." This focus on the financial and social benefits he expected to gain through his parents' deaths became a recurring theme throughout the remainder of the interrogation, providing prosecutors with powerful insights into Justin's primary motivations. The most chilling segment of the interrogation came when detectives asked Justin to walk them through the actual murders, a request that he complied with in disturbing detail and with remarkable emotional detachment. "I waited until early morning because that's when sleep is deepest. I researched that," Justin explained, speaking as if describing a science project rather than the murder of his parents. "Dad always slept on the right side of the bed, closer to the door. I shot him first because he was the bigger threat. He was stronger and had police training. Mom woke up when I shot him. She looked at me and said, 'Justin, no!' But I had already decided I had to do both of them, or the plan wouldn't work." This clinical description of the murders, delivered without apparent remorse or emotional distress, was recorded in its entirety and would later become what prosecutor Victoria Palmer called the most damning evidence of this defendant's state of mind when presented at trial. The teenager's affect, while describing shooting his mother, calm, detached, almost bored, stunned even the experienced detectives conducting the interrogation. When asked why he waited more than an hour to call 911 after shooting his parents, Justin revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his planning. "I read that sometimes people can survive gunshot wounds if they get help right away, so I wanted to make absolutely sure they were dead before calling anyone," he explained. "I sat in the hallway and played games on my phone while I waited. Then I practiced my scared voice before I made the call." This calculated delay to ensure his parents could not be revived, combined with his admission of rehearsing his emotional performance for the 911 operator, demonstrated a level of callousness that transcended typical adolescent poor decision-making. Detective Anderson, a 20-year veteran of homicide investigations, would later testify that in all his years of interviewing killers, he had never encountered someone so young who showed such complete emotional disconnection from their actions or victims, especially when those victims were the person's own parents. After nearly 12 hours of interrogation, as Justin became visibly exhausted but continued to speak freely about his actions and motivations, the detectives finally concluded the session. "We have your confession on record, Justin," Detective Martinez stated. "Is there anything else you want to tell us about what happened?" The teenager considered the question for a moment before asking, "What happens to their money now? Do I still get it, or does it go to my grandparents?" This final question focused entirely on the financial consequences rather than the human toll of his actions, cemented the prosecution's understanding of Justin's primary motivation and provided a devastating conclusion to the recorded interrogation. As Justin was led back to his cell, Detective Anderson noted in his case file that the teenager asked no questions about funeral arrangements, expressed no interest in personal mementos from his family home, and showed no visible grief or remorse, observations that would feature prominently in both the prosecution's case presentation and the subsequent psychological evaluations conducted as the case moved toward trial. The interrogation of Justin Westerfield provided investigators and prosecutors with far more than just a confession. It offered a window into the mind of a teenager who had compartmentalized the murder of his parents as a practical solution to what he perceived as the problem of their authority over his life. In most juvenile cases, even serious ones, we see flashes of the child beneath the crime, moments of vulnerability, fear, confusion, District Attorney Mark Sullivan remarked after reviewing the interrogation footage. What made the Westerfield case so disturbing was the complete absence of those moments. Justin discussed murdering his parents with the emotional investment most teenagers would show when discussing a homework assignment they found boring. This psychological assessment, combined with the physical evidence of premeditation exemplified by the ammunition purchase, created a case that would challenge the court system's approach to juvenile justice and raise difficult questions about adolescent brain development, parental authority, and the nature of evil in one of Kansas City's most notorious murder cases. The Jackson County Courthouse stood imposingly in downtown Kansas City, its limestone facade and classical columns projecting the gravitas of justice as the trial of Justin Westerfield began on September 12, 2022, just over 5 months after the Easter Sunday murders. Court officers had established heightened security procedures in anticipation of the intense public interest in the case, with metal detectors at each entrance and additional bailiffs stationed throughout the building. Journalists from national news outlets lined up before dawn to secure seats in Judge Maria Sanchez's courtroom, where the 14-year-old defendant would be tried as an adult for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The courthouse had the atmosphere of a major political trial rather than a juvenile case, reported veteran legal journalist Simon Parker. The combination of the defendant's young age, the victim's respected standing in the community, and the shocking premeditation evidenced by the ammunition purchase created a perfect storm of public fascination and horror. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution and defense tables were positioned on opposite sides of the central aisle, with Justin Westerfield seated beside his attorneys in a tailored navy blue suit that made him look older than his 14 years. Judge Maria Sanchez, known for her no-nonsense approach and meticulous attention to procedural details, began the proceedings by addressing the sensitive nature of trying a juvenile defendant in adult court. This court acknowledges the defendant's age as a factor that will be considered at appropriate junctures in these proceedings, she stated for the record. However, the certification to try the defendant as an adult has been properly executed and upheld on appeal. This court will proceed with the understanding that the charges against Mr. Westerfield are of the most serious nature regardless of his age. Judge Sanchez then directed her attention to the jury pool, emphasizing the importance of setting aside any preconceived notions about adolescent behavior or capacity. You must evaluate the evidence presented based solely on the law as I will instruct you, not on your personal feelings about what 14-year-olds typically can or cannot understand about the consequences of their actions. This clear direction established the serious judicial tone that would characterize the entire trial and signaled the court's intent to hold Justin accountable as if he were an adult if the evidence warranted it. Prosecutor Victoria Palmer, a seasoned homicide attorney with over 20 years of experience, approached the podium for her opening statement, with a demeanor that balanced professional gravity with restrained emotion, appropriate to the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about calculation, not impulse," she began, her voice clear and measured in the hushed courtroom. "The evidence will show that the defendant, Justin Westerfield, executed a plan that began not in a moment of teenage rage, but in weeks of detailed preparation that included the creation of a sophisticated fake ID, the purchase of ammunition matching his father's hunting rifle, and the documentation of his murderous intentions in a journal he believed would never be found." Palmer then held up a clear evidence bag containing the ammunition box, turning it slowly so all jurors could clearly see it. This empty box represents the moment when Justin Westerfield's thoughts of killing his parents transformed into definitive actions toward that goal. When he purchased this ammunition using a fake ID bearing his father's name on March 17, 2022, he crossed the line from fantasy to deadly intent. The prosecution's opening laid out a meticulous timeline that emphasized Justin's extraordinary level of planning and awareness. 3 weeks before Easter Sunday, the defendant stood at a counter at Heartland Hunting Supplies and purchased the exact ammunition needed for his father's hunting rifle, the weapon he had already selected for the murders, Palmer continued. He did not use ammunition already available in the home, which might have suggested a spontaneous decision. Instead, he specifically acquired new ammunition, demonstrating both premeditation and an understanding that what he was planning was wrong. Otherwise, why the elaborate deception with a fake ID? The prosecutor then walked the jury through the events of Easter Sunday morning, describing how Justin had retrieved the rifle from his father's locked cabinet using a key he had secretly duplicated, how he had positioned himself at the foot of his parents' bed, and how he had methodically executed first his father and then his mother when she awoke to the sound of the first shot. This was not a child lashing out in a moment of emotional turbulence, Palmer concluded. This was a calculated execution carried out by someone who valued freedom to party and spend money more than he valued his parents' lives. Defense attorney Robert Mercado faced the daunting task of presenting an opening statement that could acknowledge the overwhelming evidence while still offering the jury a reason to consider a lesser charge than first-degree murder. "Ladies and gentlemen, the facts of this case are not in dispute," Mercado began, surprising many in the courtroom with this forthright admission. "Justin Westerfield caused the deaths of his parents, James and Emily Westerfield. The question before you is not what happened, but why it happened, and what that why means under our system of justice." Mercado, known for his empathetic approach with juries, walked closer to the jury box, his voice becoming more conversational. "You will hear evidence about the developing teenage brain, scientific facts about how adolescents process information, evaluate consequences, and respond to perceived constraints on their autonomy. This evidence is not presented to excuse what happened, but to help you understand the context in which a 14-year-old might arrive at a solution that no fully developed adult brain would consider rational or proportionate." Mercado's opening established the defense's strategy of focusing on diminished capacity rather than denying Justin's actions. "The ammunition purchase that the prosecution has highlighted actually demonstrates the immature thinking at work here," he argued. "An adult planning a murder might purchase ammunition in cash at a store far from home, wearing a disguise that couldn't be connected to them. Justin used a crude fake ID with his own altered photograph at a local store where his father was known, and left the receipt in the box in his own home. These are not the actions of a cold, calculating adult criminal, but of a teenager whose brain lacks the fully developed capacity for complex consequence evaluation. This attempt to reframe the evidence of premeditation as evidence of immaturity represented the defense's primary strategy, acknowledging the facts while challenging the prosecution's interpretation of what those facts revealed about Justin's mental state and degree of criminal responsibility. The first prosecution witness was Officer Rebecca Chen, one of the first responders to the Westerfield home on Easter Sunday morning. Officer Chen described entering the residence and finding Justin sitting on the stairs, appearing distressed. He told us someone had broken in and shot his parents, she testified. He said he had been hiding in his closet and was too scared to come out until he was sure the intruder was gone. The prosecution then played Chen's body camera footage, which showed Justin gesturing toward the upstairs while saying, "I heard the shots from my bedroom. I was too scared to come out right away." The footage captured Justin's initial statement, before he knew that investigators would discover evidence contradicting his home invasion narrative, providing the jury with their first glimpse of the teenager's capacity for deception under pressure. Officer Chen then described proceeding upstairs to find James and Emily Westerfield dead in their bed, with James having a fatal gunshot wound to the head, and Emily with a chest wound, confirming the execution-style nature of the killings that the prosecution had outlined. Forensic technician Marcus Green provided detailed testimony about the crime scene evidence, using diagrams and photographs to illustrate the position of the bodies, the location of the rifle on the floor, and the blood spatter patterns that indicated the shooter's position at the foot of the bed. The physical evidence was consistent with someone standing approximately here, Green testified, indicating a spot on the diagram at the foot of the bed. The angle of both shots indicates a firing position from this location, and we recovered shell casings from this area as well. The technician then introduced the empty ammunition box found in James Westerfield's gun cabinet, explaining how it had drawn his attention because it was the only completely empty box among several partially used ones. Inside this box, crumpled at the bottom, we discovered a receipt from Heartland Hunting Supplies dated March 17, 2022, for the purchase of a box of .30-06 Springfield cartridges, the exact type used in the murders. The prosecution's case gained momentum with the testimony of Braden Murphy, the young clerk from Heartland Hunting Supplies who had sold the ammunition to Justin. He presented ID that looked like an official driver's license for James Westerfield, Murphy testified, visibly uncomfortable as he glanced at Justin across the courtroom. The photo didn't exactly match the person standing in front of me, but he explained that it was an old picture, and he was wearing a cap pulled down low. I didn't want to accuse a police officer of having a fake ID. The prosecution then played the enhanced security footage showing Justin making the purchase, dressed in his father's jacket and baseball cap. The footage clearly captured the teenager's deliberate attempt to appear older and his careful survey of the store before approaching the counter, behavior that Prosecutor Palmer emphasized as evidence of consciousness of guilt and understanding that what he was doing was wrong. Document forensics expert Dr. Elaine Peterson provided critical testimony about the sophisticated nature of the fake ID recovered from Justin's bedroom. The defendant created this forgery by digitally altering his own school photograph to appear older, printing it on high-quality photo paper and laminating it to mimic an official Missouri driver's license, she explained, while the jury was shown enlarged images of both the fake ID and Justin's actual school ID for comparison. While not professional quality, this forgery demonstrated significant effort and planning, including research on the format and security features of Missouri licenses. Dr. Peterson noted that creating the fake ID would have required multiple steps and specialized materials, further undermining any defense suggestion that the ammunition purchase had been an impulsive decision rather than part of a calculated plan. The most powerful prosecution witness of the trial's opening days was Detective Ryan Anderson, who provided a comprehensive overview of the investigation that had transformed their understanding from an apparent home invasion to a case of patricide and matricide. As we examined the physical evidence, Numerous inconsistencies emerged in Justin Westerfield's initial statement, Anderson testified. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen from the home, and the security system had not been triggered. Most significantly, we discovered that the ammunition used in the murders had been purchased 3 weeks earlier by someone using a fake ID bearing James Westerfield's name. Anderson then walked the jury through the discovery of Justin's hidden journal beneath the backyard shed, where the teenager had documented his murder plans in chilling detail. The journal contained multiple drafts of what the defendant planned to tell police after killing his parents, including the home invasion story he initially provided to responding officers. Detective Anderson's testimony culminated with the playing of selected segments from Justin's 12-hour interrogation. The courtroom fell silent as jurors watched Justin transition from denial to justification, his initial claims of innocence giving way to explanations for why he felt entitled to kill his parents. If they had just given me some freedom, none of this would have happened. It's kind of their fault if you think about it, Justin said in the recording, a statement that audibly shocked several jurors. When the video showed Justin explaining that he had waited over an hour before calling 911 to ensure his parents were dead, one female juror visibly recoiled. The prosecution strategically ended the video segment with Justin's final question. What happens to their money now? Do I still get it, or does it go to my grandparents? Leaving the jury with a powerful impression of the teenager's priorities in the immediate aftermath of confessing to killing his parents. The defense began its cross-examination of prosecution witnesses by focusing not on disputing facts, but on contextualizing them within adolescent development frameworks. During cross-examination of Detective Anderson, defense attorney Mercado asked, "In your 20 years of homicide investigations, have you observed differences in how juveniles and adults typically attempt to cover up crimes?" Anderson acknowledged that juveniles generally make more mistakes and demonstrate less sophisticated planning than adult offenders. Mercado then highlighted specific aspects of Justin's actions, leaving the receipt in the ammunition box, hiding the journal in a shallow hole that dogs easily detected, making no attempt to establish an alibi for the time of the murders, as evidence of magical thinking, characteristic of adolescent cognitive development, rather than adult criminal calculation. As the first week of trial concluded, the prosecution had established a compelling narrative of premeditation through the ammunition purchase, the fake ID creation, and Justin's own damning statements during interrogation. The defense strategy of acknowledging the acts while challenging their interpretation had yet to gain significant traction with the jury, many of whom were visibly disturbed by the calculated nature of the crime and Justin's apparent lack of remorse. Legal analysts following the case noted that the ammunition purchase had emerged as the pivotal evidence point, representing the clearest link between Justin's planning phase and the eventual execution of his parents. If the defense can't create reasonable doubt about what that ammunition purchase signifies about Justin's intent and understanding, they have very little chance of avoiding a first-degree murder conviction, observed legal commentator Rachel Goldstein. It's virtually impossible to argue that purchasing ammunition with a fake ID 3 weeks before the killings represents anything other than premeditation and deliberation, the two key elements required for first-degree murder. The 8th day of trial marked a critical juncture as Victor Ramirez, owner of Heartland Hunting Supplies, took the stand to provide context for the ammunition purchase that had become central to the prosecution's case. Ramirez, a former Marine with 20 years of experience in firearms retail, explained the store's procedures for ammunition sales. "We're required by law to verify the purchaser's age and identity for all ammunition sales," he testified, his military bearing evident in his precise speech and upright posture. For rifle ammunition like the 30-6 Springfield rounds purchased in this case, the buyer must be at least 18 years old. Prosecutor Victoria Palmer then directed Ramirez's attention to the store's security footage from March 17th, asking him to narrate what he observed. The individual in the video spends several minutes watching the registers, apparently waiting until my more experienced manager steps away for a break, leaving only our newest employee at the counter. This suggests deliberate timing rather than a random visit. Ramirez's assessment of Justin's strategic approach to the purchase reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of a calculated, premeditated act rather than an impulsive decision. Digital forensics expert Aidan Morris provided testimony that further solidified the link between the ammunition purchase and Justin's broader murder plan. We recovered search history from the defendant's devices showing queries for how to make a convincing fake ID and what information is needed for ammunition purchase in the weeks leading up to the March 17th transaction, Morris explained, as screenshots of Justin's search history were displayed for the jury. Additionally, we found that Justin had taken photographs of his father's driver's license on February 28th, 3 weeks before creating the fake ID he would use at Heartland Hunting Supplies. Morris then methodically walked the jury through Justin's digital preparations, including deleted files recovered from his school laptop showing multiple drafts of the fake ID design and research on Missouri driver's license security features. The digital evidence demonstrates a sustained, multi-step planning process that began approximately 6 weeks before the ammunition purchase and 9 weeks before the murders themselves, Morris concluded, providing the jury with a concrete timeline that emphasized the extended period over which Justin had developed and refined his plan. The prosecution's case reached an emotional crescendo with the testimony of Martha Barnett, Emily Westerfield's mother, and Justin's maternal grandmother. Visibly grief-stricken but composed, Mrs. Barnett described the devastating impact of losing both her daughter and her son-in-law while simultaneously coming to terms with her grandson's role in their deaths. Emily and James were loving parents, she testified, her voice occasionally breaking with emotion. They had rules for Justin, of course, but nothing unusual or harsh, basic expectations about schoolwork, curfews, and knowing where he was and who he was with. Mrs. Barnett recounted a conversation with her daughter just 2 weeks before the murders, in which Emily had expressed concern about Justin's increasing secretiveness and demands for more spending money. Emily told me, "Mom, he doesn't understand the value of money. He thinks we're depriving him by not buying him everything his wealthier classmates have." This testimony directly connected Justin's financial motivations to the growing tensions in the Westerfield household, while contradicting any defense narrative of unusually strict or unreasonable parenting. The most scientifically significant testimony came from Dr. Caroline Reeves, a renowned neuropsychologist specializing in adolescent brain development, who appeared as an expert witness for the defense. Dr. Reeves used brain imaging studies and developmental research to explain how the teenage brain differs structurally and functionally from the adult brain. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, consequence evaluation, and long-term planning, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. Dr. Reeves explained, using colorful brain scans to illustrate her points. Teenagers literally process information differently than adults do, particularly when it comes to risk assessment and emotional regulation. When defense attorney Mercado asked specifically about Justin's ammunition purchase using a fake ID, Dr. Reeves characterized it as paradoxically both planned and impulsive. Planned in its execution, but impulsive in its failure to fully consider consequences, which is typical of adolescent cognition. This testimony represented the defense's most substantial attempt to reframe the premeditated nature of Justin's actions within a scientific context that might mitigate his legal culpability. The prosecution countered the defense's neuropsychological arguments with testimony from their own expert, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Layton, who had conducted a comprehensive evaluation of Justin Westerfield. While I acknowledge the general principles of adolescent brain development that Dr. Reeves described, those general patterns don't override individual assessment, Dr. Layton testified. In my evaluation of Justin Westerfield, I observed a young man who demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong, who could articulate the consequences of his actions, and who engaged in sophisticated planning to achieve his goal. Dr. Layton then methodically dismantled the defense's diminished capacity arguments by highlighting specific elements of Justin's behavior that demonstrated advanced cognitive functioning. The defendant's journal entries show that he anticipated potential obstacles to his plan and developed contingencies. For example, he noted that if his father woke during the approach, he would claim he heard a noise downstairs and was checking on it. This level of scenario planning indicates sophisticated consequential thinking, not typically impaired even in adolescence. A pivotal moment in the trial occurred during the testimony of Justin's friend, Tyler Jenkins, who described conversations with the defendant in the weeks before the murders. Justin kept talking about how his life would be so much better once his parents weren't controlling him anymore, Jenkins testified, visibly uncomfortable as he avoided looking directly at Justin. At first I thought he just meant when he turned 18 and could move out, but he started saying things like, "I won't have to wait that long and I'll be free way before then." Jenkins then recounted a specific conversation from late March, approximately 2 weeks after the ammunition purchase and 2 weeks before the murders. Justin showed me websites of expensive condos in the Plaza District and said, "This is where I'll be living soon." When I asked how he could afford that, he just smiled and said, "I'll have access to plenty of money soon." This testimony directly connected Justin's financial motivations to his murder plan and demonstrated that he had continued developing his post-murder life plans in the weeks between purchasing the ammunition and killing his parents. School counselor Margaret Chen provided critical context for Justin's state of mind in the period leading up to the murders, recounting 3 counseling sessions she had conducted with him between January and March 2022. Justin expressed increasing frustration with what he described as his parents' controlling behavior, Chen testified. When I suggested standard conflict resolution strategies, he dismissed them as pointless because, in his words, "My parents will never change, so the situation has to change another way." Chen described how Justin had become fixated on the financial aspects of his relationship with his parents, repeatedly comparing his allowance and lifestyle unfavorably to those of wealthier classmates at Pembroke Hills School. In our last session on March 28th, Justin made a statement that concerned me enough to contact his mother. He said, "Sometimes I think about just making them disappear so I could live my own life." When I explored this statement with him, he quickly claimed it was just a figure of speech, but his affect while saying it was disturbingly flat. The defense attempted to counter this damaging testimony through character witnesses who knew Justin before the dramatic personality changes that preceded the murders. His 6th-grade teacher, Michelle Donovan, described him as a bright, generally well-behaved student who showed empathy toward classmates and respect for authority figures. Just 2 years earlier, former Little League coach Steve Harrison recalled how 13-year-old Justin had helped younger players master batting techniques and had shown good sportsmanship even during losing games. These glimpses of Justin's earlier, more positive character traits were offered by the defense as evidence that his violent transformation was the result of developmental turbulence rather than inherent criminality. The Justin Westerfield who purchased that ammunition was not the same Justin Westerfield who sat in my classroom 2 years earlier, Donovan testified. Something fundamental had changed in him, and I believe that change reflects the volatile nature of adolescent development rather than a calculated transformation into a killer. The most technically detailed testimony came from ballistics expert Dr. Marcus Reed, who established the direct connection between the ammunition purchased on March 17th and the bullets that killed James and Emily Westerfield. The ammunition used in the Westerfield murders came from lot number RK47203, which is a specific manufacturing batch with distinct microscopic characteristics, Dr. Reed explained, using magnified images to show the jury these identifying features. The spent casings recovered from the crime scene bear these same batch-specific markings, definitively matching them to the lot number printed on the box purchased at Heartland Hunting Supplies. This testimony eliminated any possibility that Justin had used older ammunition already present in the Westerfield home, directly connecting his premeditated purchase to the murder weapon. Dr. Reed further testified that the .30-06 Springfield ammunition was significant overkill for home defense, being designed for large game hunting with maximum stopping power, suggesting that Justin had selected it specifically for its lethal effectiveness, rather than grabbing whatever ammunition was available. The defense's case suffered a significant setback during the testimony of child psychologist Dr. William Freeman, who had evaluated Justin specifically for the trial. Under direct examination, Dr. Freeman initially supported the defense narrative by describing Justin as a teenager whose ability to fully appreciate the consequences of his actions was impaired by normal developmental limitations. However, under Prosecutor Palmer's skillful cross-examination, Dr. Freeman was forced to acknowledge that Justin's journal entries demonstrated an unusual level of planning and awareness for his age. Would you agree that writing multiple versions of a fabricated home invasion story explicitly to mislead police suggests an awareness that killing one's parents is wrong? Palmer asked. Yes, that would indicate an understanding of the moral and legal wrongness of the planned action, Dr. Freeman reluctantly conceded, and would calculating the optimal time to commit the murders based on sleep cycle research suggest an ability to plan and consider consequences, Palmer continued. It would suggest planning capability, yes, Dr. Freeman acknowledged, visibly uncomfortable with how his testimony was unfolding. These concessions severely undermined the defense's diminished capacity strategy, as their own expert effectively confirmed that Justin had demonstrated the understanding and planning capabilities necessary for first-degree murder. The prosecution's final witness before resting their case was FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Eliza Montgomery, who provided expert testimony on the significance of Justin's post-murder behavior. In the hours after killing his parents, the defendant engaged in what we call evidence of normality, attempting to establish an appearance of routine behavior to distance himself from suspicion, Dr. Montgomery explained. He showered and changed clothes, ate breakfast, and spent over an hour on his phone playing games before calling 911. This calculated delay, which he later admitted was to ensure his parents were dead, demonstrates both consciousness of guilt and goal-oriented thinking. Dr. Montgomery then analyzed Justin's 911 call, identifying specific deceptive language patterns and emotional inconsistencies that suggested rehearsal rather than genuine distress. The defendant's behavior throughout the investigation followed what we typically observe in premeditated domestic homicides committed by adults, not the panicked, disorganized reactions more common in juvenile offenders acting impulsively, she concluded. From the ammunition purchase through the 911 call and subsequent interrogation, Justin Westerfield's actions demonstrate a level of planning, deception, and post-crime management that indicates full awareness of both the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. In a strategic move that surprised many legal observers, the defense team chose not to have Justin Westerfield testify in his own defense. After carefully considering all options, we've determined that Mr. Bim Westerfield will exercise his constitutional right not to testify, Attorney Robert Mercado, informed the court. This decision protected Justin from cross-examination by Prosecutor Palmer, who would have likely used his own journal entries and interrogation statements to devastating effect, but it also meant the jury would never hear directly from the defendant about his state of mind or motivations. Instead, the defense concluded their case with testimony from Dr. Sarah Jenkins, an expert on juvenile justice reform, who spoke about adolescent brain development and the capacity for rehabilitation. Even in cases of serious violent offenses, adolescents have demonstrated remarkable capacity for change and rehabilitation when provided with appropriate interventions, Dr. Jenkins testified. The neuroplasticity of the teenage brain, which contributes to poor decision-making, also creates exceptional potential for positive development and fundamental character transformation. This testimony represented the defense's final attempt to shift the jury's focus from punishment to rehabilitation potential, even as they tacitly acknowledged the overwhelming evidence of Justin's guilt. As the evidentiary phase of the trial concluded, the ammunition purchase remained the prosecution's most compelling piece of physical evidence, the tangible link between Justin's murderous thoughts and his deadly actions 3 weeks later. That single transaction at Heartland Hunting Supplies stands as irrefutable proof that these murders were not impulsive, not the result of a momentary adolescent rage, but rather the product of extended planning and preparation, Prosecutor Palmer emphasized during her closing argument. When Justin Westerfield created that fake ID, entered that store, and purchased those bullets, he crossed the line from thinking about killing his parents to actively preparing to kill them. And that preparation, that premeditation, is precisely what distinguishes first-degree murder from lesser homicide charges. With this argument, Palmer directed the jury's attention back to the physical evidence that had initiated the investigation's focus on Justin, and that had remained central to the prosecution's case throughout the trial. The empty ammunition box, the store receipt, and the security footage that collectively demonstrated the calculated nature of a crime that had left 2 dedicated public servants dead and their only child facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The jury in the Justin Westerfield murder trial received their final instructions from Judge Maria Sanchez on the morning of September 27, 2022. After 15 days of testimony that had drawn national media attention and packed the Kansas City courtroom daily with spectators, journalists, and law enforcement officers supporting their fallen colleagues' memory. You have heard extensive evidence and arguments regarding the defendant's age and brain development, Judge Sanchez instructed the 12 jurors and 2 alternates. You may consider this evidence in your deliberations, but you must apply the law as I have instructed you regardless of the defendant's age. The elements of first-degree murder remain the same whether the defendant is 14 or 40. The judge then carefully outlined the legal requirements for the jury to find Justin guilty of first-degree murder, that he caused the death of James and Emily Westerfield, that he did so knowingly, and that he did so after deliberation, which he defined as cool reflection upon the matter for any length of time, no matter how brief. The jury was also instructed on the lesser-included offenses of second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter, should they find that the evidence did not support the highest charge. The jury began their deliberations at 11:47 a.m., sequestered in a wood-paneled conference room with the evidence binders, exhibits, and video equipment necessary to review the key testimony and physical evidence presented during the trial. Court observers noted the jurors requesting to review 3 specific items within the first hour of deliberation. The security footage from Heartland Hunting Supplies showing Justin purchasing the ammunition, the pages from Justin's journal detailing his murder plans, and the recording of his interrogation where he explained waiting an hour after the shootings to ensure his parents were dead before calling 911. The jury's focus on these three pieces of evidence suggests they're evaluating the core question of premeditation rather than debating basic facts of the case, noted legal analyst Catherine Rhodes, who had been providing commentary on the trial for local television. Since the defense essentially conceded that Justin killed his parents, the deliberations are likely centered on his degree of culpability rather than his basic guilt or innocence. Outside the courthouse, an unusual atmosphere had developed as two distinct groups of demonstrators assembled on opposite sides of the main entrance. On the east side, approximately 75 supporters of the Westerfield family, including dozens of Kansas City police officers not currently on duty and social workers who had worked with Emily, held signs reading "Justice for James and Emily" and "No Mercy for Premeditated Murder." On the west side, a smaller group of approximately 40 juvenile justice reform advocates carried signs with messages like "Kids are not adults" and "Brain science matters in justice." The two groups maintained a respectful distance from each other, with police barricades ensuring separation, but their competing chants and speeches created a tense backdrop to the jury's closed-door deliberations. The case had clearly touched a nerve in the community, raising fundamental questions about how society should respond when a child commits an adult crime with apparent adult calculation. Inside the courthouse, Justin Westerfield waited in a secure holding room adjacent to the courtroom, accompanied by his defense team and a juvenile corrections officer. Courthouse sources described the teenager as unnervingly calm during this waiting period, reading a science fiction novel and occasionally asking his attorneys procedural questions about what would happen after the verdict regardless of the outcome. There was a striking disconnect between his affect and the gravity of the moment, one court officer later commented. Most defendants, especially juveniles, show visible stress during jury deliberations, pacing, crying, praying. Justin was flipping through his book as if he was waiting for a dental appointment, rather than a verdict that could put him behind bars for the rest of his life. This behavioral observation aligned with the prosecution's portrayal throughout the trial of a teenager whose emotional responses were fundamentally disconnected from the horrific nature of his actions. The jury reached their verdict after just 6 hours and 22 minutes of deliberation, a surprisingly short time given the complexity of the case and the serious nature of the charges. Court officers notified Judge Sanchez at 6:09 p.m. that the jury had reached a unanimous decision, and the judge ordered all parties to reassemble in the courtroom for the verdict announcement. As the principals took their places, prosecutors at their table, defense attorneys and Justin at theirs, and the victim's extended family in the first row of the gallery, a palpable tension filled the courtroom. Martha and Richard Barnett, Emily's parents, sat holding hands, their faces etched with the impossible grief of having lost their daughter to their grandson's actions. James Westerfield's parents and siblings occupied the seats beside them, a unified front of family members whose lives had been shattered by the Easter Sunday murders. Judge Sanchez addressed the packed courtroom before the jury was brought in, reminding everyone that regardless of the verdict, decorum would be maintained. This court understands the emotional nature of this case, but I will not tolerate outbursts or demonstrations of any kind when the verdict is read, she stated firmly. Anyone unable to control their reactions will be removed from the courtroom. The judge then nodded to the bailiff, who opened the side door to escort the jury back to their box. Court observers noted that several jurors appeared emotionally drained, with the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as a hospital administrator, clutching the verdict form with visibly trembling hands. The jury avoided looking directly at Justin as they filed in, a behavior pattern that experienced court watchers often interpret as a sign of a guilty verdict. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Sanchez asked once all jurors were seated and the courtroom had fallen completely silent. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson responded, her voice steady despite her visible tension. The bailiff collected the verdict form and delivered it to Judge Sanchez, who reviewed it briefly before returning it for the foreperson to read. In the case of State of Missouri versus Justin Westerfield, on the count of murder in the first degree of James Westerfield, how do you find? Judge Sanchez asked. The foreperson rose, her voice clear in the silent courtroom. We find the defendant guilty. A collective exhalation seemed to sweep through the courtroom, though no one made a sound. And on the count of murder in the first degree of Emily Westerfield, how do you find? The judge continued. We find the defendant guilty, the foreperson repeated, her voice slightly stronger this time. Judge Sanchez then polled each juror individually to confirm the verdict was unanimous, with each responding yes when asked if these were their verdicts. Justin Westerfield's reaction to the guilty verdicts became perhaps the final piece of evidence supporting the prosecution's characterization of his disturbing emotional disconnect. While most defendants show some visible response to a guilty verdict, tears, shock, anger, or despair, Justin merely blinked slowly and turned to his attorney to ask, in a voice loud enough to be heard by those nearby, how long until the sentencing? This apparent focus on procedure rather than the moral weight of being found responsible for his parents' murders reinforced the impression of a teenager who viewed the entire process through a coldly pragmatic lens. Defense attorney Robert Mercado placed his hand on Justin's shoulder and whispered something in his ear, likely instructing him to maintain his composure. But observers noted that such counsel seemed unnecessary given the teenager's already flat effect. The impact of the verdict on the Westerfield family members present in the courtroom was immediately apparent and heartbreaking. Martha Barnett, who had lost her daughter to her grandson's actions, covered her face with her hands and shook with silent sobs as her husband placed his arm around her shoulders. James Westerfield's mother, Catherine Westerfield, stared directly at Justin's back with an expression of profound grief mixed with incomprehension, the family matriarch seemingly still unable to reconcile the cheerful grandson she had known with the convicted murderer sitting before her. Other family members embraced quietly, their relief at the verdict tempered by the knowledge that justice for James and Emily did nothing to bring them back or heal the impossible family fracture created by Justin's actions. No true victory was possible in a case where the perpetrator was the son of the victims, and the family's muted response reflected this tragic reality. In accordance with Missouri law, Judge Sanchez ordered a pre-sentencing investigation and set the sentencing hearing for October 31, 2022, approximately 1 month later. She then addressed Justin directly. Mr. Westerfield, you have been found guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree. You will be held without bail pending your sentencing hearing. Do you understand? Justin nodded and responded with a quiet, "Yes, ma'am," one of the few instances of appropriate deference he had shown throughout the proceedings. As court officers approached to escort Justin back to juvenile detention, where he would remain until sentencing due to his age, the teenager turned briefly toward the gallery. Whether he was looking for his grandparents or simply surveying the crowd of spectators was unclear, but many present interpreted this final glance as Justin taking stock of the world he would likely not experience as a free person for decades, if ever again. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Victoria Palmer held a brief press conference where she emphasized that the verdict represented justice rather than triumph. Today's verdict cannot restore what was lost on Easter Sunday, Palmer stated, her tone somber, despite the successful prosecution. James and Emily Westerfield dedicated their lives to public service and to raising their son with love and guidance. The evidence presented at trial showed that Justin Westerfield responded to normal parental boundaries with calculated, premeditated violence. Palmer specifically highlighted the ammunition purchase as the clearest evidence of premeditation that had led to the first-degree murder convictions. When Justin Westerfield used a fake ID to purchase ammunition 3 weeks before the murders, he demonstrated both planning and an understanding that what he intended to do was wrong. The jury recognized this act for what it was, a critical step in a premeditated plan to kill his parents for financial gain and personal freedom. Defense attorney Robert Mercado made a shorter statement, announcing the defense team's intention to appeal the verdict based on several legal grounds, including their contention that Justin should have remained in juvenile court despite the seriousness of the charges. Today's verdict represents a failure of our justice system to meaningfully account for adolescent brain development and the reduced culpability that should attach to juvenile offenders even in cases of serious violent crime, Mercado argued. While we acknowledge the gravity of Justin's actions and the profound loss suffered by the Westerfield family, we maintain that a 14-year-old lacks the neurological development to be held to the same standard of culpability as an adult offender. Legal analysts noted that such appeals rarely succeed in cases with such overwhelming evidence of premeditation, particularly given that the ammunition purchase had established planning that extended weeks before the actual murders. As news of the verdict spread throughout Kansas City and across the national media landscape, public reaction revealed deep divisions in how society views juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes. Law enforcement communities and victims' rights advocates generally supported the verdict, arguing that the calculated nature of the murders justified adult consequences regardless of Justin's age. Child welfare organizations and juvenile justice reform advocates expressed concern about the precedent of treating a 14-year-old as an adult in the criminal justice system, regardless of the crime's severity. Social media platforms exploded with competing hashtags, "Rah, justice for the Westerfields," and "Rah, kids are not adults," trending simultaneously as the public engaged in the same fundamental debate that had played out in the courtroom, whether a juvenile who commits a premeditated murder with adult calculation should face adult consequences. The jury's swift deliberation and unanimous verdict suggested that, at least in this specific case with its overwhelming evidence of planning and premeditation, the scale had tipped decisively toward holding Justin fully accountable despite his age. "The ammunition purchase was the turning point for us," one juror later told the Kansas City Star, on condition of anonymity after the judge had lifted the gag order following sentencing. "When we saw that security footage of Justin using a fake ID to buy bullets 3 weeks before the murders, it became impossible to view this as an impulsive teenage act. That single piece of evidence established that these murders were planned well in advance, with clear understanding of both the practical steps needed and the wrongfulness of the intended action." This juror's statement confirmed what legal observers had suspected, that the foundational clue of the ammunition purchase had indeed been the evidentiary keystone upon which the prosecution had successfully built its case for premeditated murder. The Jackson County Courthouse was even more crowded for Justin Westerfield's sentencing hearing on October 31, 2022, than it had been for the verdict announcement a month earlier. Halloween decorations adorned downtown Kansas City businesses, creating a macabre backdrop for what many legal observers anticipated would be one of the most significant juvenile sentencing decisions in Missouri's recent judicial history. Inside the courtroom, security had been further enhanced, with additional officers stationed at all entrances and metal detectors set to their highest sensitivity. Court staff had prepared the room for the extensive victim impact statements scheduled for the hearing, arranging a podium directly facing the defense table where Justin Westerfield would be forced to look directly at each speaker addressing the court about the impact of his crimes. Judge Maria Sanchez opened the proceedings by acknowledging the unique nature of the case before her. This court is tasked today with one of the most challenging sentencing decisions a judge can face, she began, her voice grave. How does society respond when a child commits a crime of adult calculation and consequence? The jury has determined, beyond reasonable doubt, that Justin Westerfield committed premeditated murder, but his age at the time of these offenses, 14 years, cannot and should not be ignored in determining the appropriate sentence. Judge Sanchez then outlined the sentencing options available under Missouri law for a juvenile convicted of first-degree murder in adult court, ranging from a minimum of life with the possibility of parole after 25 years to the maximum penalty of life without the possibility of parole, a sentence that the Supreme Court had ruled could only be applied to juveniles in the rarest of circumstances, showing permanent incorrigibility. The victim impact statements began with Martha Barnett, Emily Westerfield's mother, who approached the podium with visible effort, supported by her husband Richard. "I stand here today in an impossible position," Mrs. Barnett began, her voice quavering but determined. "I have lost my only daughter to an act of violence committed by my only grandson. There is no language adequate to describe the specific form of family devastation." Mrs. Barnett detailed how Emily had dedicated her life to protecting vulnerable children through her work as a social worker, the bitter irony being that she could not protect herself from her own child. Emily believed so deeply in the potential for troubled children to heal and grow with the right support and boundaries. She applied those same principles in raising Justin with patience, consistency, and love. Mrs. Barnett then addressed Justin directly, her voice strengthening as she looked at her grandson. "Justin, your mother's last words were, 'Justin, no.' She recognized you in her final moment, and still her instinct was to reach out to you, to try to stop you from destroying your own life, even as you were ending hers. That was who your mother was, protecting you until her last breath." James Westerfield's father, retired firefighter Robert Westerfield, provided powerful testimony about the generational impact of Justin's crimes. "My son followed me into public service, but he chose law enforcement instead of firefighting. We used to debate which was more dangerous," Mr. Westerfield recalled, his weathered face lined with grief. "Never in those discussions did either of us consider that the greatest danger to James would come from within his own home, from the son he coached in Little League and taught to fish." Mr. Westerfield described how James had been the first in their family to attend college, how proud he had been of his son's promotions within the Kansas City Police Department, and how devastated their extended family had been to lose him, not in the line of duty, but in his own bed at the hands of the child he had devoted his life to raising. Looking directly at Justin, Mr. Westerfield concluded, "You didn't just take my son's life, you stole all the good he would have done for this community for decades to come. All the people he would have helped, all the children who would have looked up to him as a model of what a police officer should be. That theft of potential is immeasurable." The impact statements continued with colleagues of both James and Emily Westerfield. Police Captain Michael Harrison spoke about James's mentorship of younger officers and his community policing initiatives that had built trust in previously high-tension neighborhoods. "Officer Westerfield represented the very best of what we strive for in the Kansas City Police Department," Captain Harrison stated. "He understood that the badge was a responsibility, not just an authority. He was the officer we sent to schools for career days because he embodied the principles we want the public to associate with law enforcement." Emily's supervisor from Jackson County Family Services, Dr. Stephanie Nelson, described the devastating impact of Emily's murder on the vulnerable children in her caseload. Some of these children had Emily as the one consistent, trustworthy adult in their lives. Her murder re-traumatized kids who had already experienced too much loss and betrayal. Dr. Nelson then addressed the court directly. The irony that Emily spent her career protecting children from family violence, only to die from it herself, is almost too painful to contemplate. The most emotionally charged moment of the sentencing hearing came when James Westerfield's police partner, Officer Thomas Reynolds, approached the podium in his formal dress uniform. "I was with James the day before he was murdered," Officer Reynolds began, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "We were on patrol, and he was showing me pictures of the Easter decorations Emily had put up. He mentioned that, despite Justin being in one of his moody teenage phases, they were planning a family Easter egg hunt like they did every year." Reynolds paused, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. James never knew that while he was proudly showing me those family photos, Justin had already purchased the ammunition that would be used to kill him less than 48 hours later. He never knew that the Easter morning he was looking forward to would be his last. Officer Reynolds then turned to face Justin directly. "I was first on scene after the 911 call. I saw what you did to your parents. No ideology about juvenile justice can erase those images from my mind or justify the calculated cruelty of your actions." After 12 impact statements spanning nearly 3 hours, Prosecutor Victoria Palmer rose to make the state's sentencing recommendation. "Your Honor, the state of Missouri recommends that Justin Westerfield be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each count of first-degree murder to be served consecutively," Palmer stated firmly. "We acknowledge that such a recommendation for a 14-year-old defendant is extraordinary, but so too are the crimes committed in this case." Palmer methodically outlined the factors she argued justified this maximum sentence. The premeditated nature of the murders as evidenced by the ammunition purchase 3 weeks earlier, the calculated use of a fake ID, the journal documenting multiple planned versions of his cover story, and perhaps most significantly, Justin's own statements during his interrogation and his behavior throughout the trial. The defendant has shown no genuine remorse or empathy for his victims or their loved ones. His primary concerns have consistently been the practical consequences for himself, whether he would still inherit his parents' assets, when he could access his phone, how long he would be incarcerated. Defense attorney Robert Mercado presented a sharply contrasting sentencing argument, urging the court to impose the minimum sentence of life, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. "Your Honor, the Supreme Court has been clear that life without parole for juvenile offenders must be reserved only for the rare juvenile offender who exhibits such irretrievable depravity that rehabilitation is impossible," Mercado argued. "Justin Westerfield is a 14-year-old child whose brain will continue developing for more than a decade. The person he will be at 25, 35, or 45 years of age is not determined by even these serious actions committed at 14. Mercado presented statements from juvenile rehabilitation specialists who testified that even juveniles who commit violent crimes have shown significant capacity for change, particularly when provided with appropriate therapeutic interventions during their incarceration. A sentence that forecloses any possibility of future release doesn't serve justice. It merely satisfies the understandable but ultimately unproductive desire for retribution. When offered the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Justin Westerfield rose slowly from his seat, his face still showing little emotion despite the wrenching impact statements he had just witnessed. "I know I'm supposed to say I'm sorry," he began, his voice steady and clear in the silent courtroom. "Everyone has told me I need to show remorse and talk about how bad I feel about what happened." He paused, looking down at his hands for a moment before continuing. "But I don't think that's what this court wants. More lies. The truth is, I thought my parents were ruining my life with their rules and their control. I thought I deserved better than what they were giving me. I planned what I did because I wanted freedom and money." This stark admission sent murmurs through the courtroom despite Judge Sanchez's previous warnings about maintaining decorum. "I didn't think about what would happen after, not really. I just wanted what I wanted." Justin concluded with what many observers interpreted as his first genuine moment of self-awareness. "I don't know why I'm like this, why I don't feel things the way other people seem to. Maybe that's something wrong with me. I don't know if I can change or if I even want to. That's all I have to say." Judge Sanchez took a 15-minute recess after Justin's statement, returning to the bench with a written decision that suggested she had prepared extensive remarks regardless of what Justin might have said. "This court has carefully considered all factors relevant to sentencing in this case," she began. "I have weighed the defendant's youth and the neurological development arguments presented by the defense against the extraordinary premeditation evidenced in these crimes and the defendant's apparent lack of genuine remorse." Judge Sanchez then addressed Justin directly. "Mr. Westerfield, when you purchased ammunition with a fake ID 3 weeks before killing your parents, you demonstrated a level of planning that belies any claim that these murders were impulsive acts of an underdeveloped adolescent brain. Your journal entries, with their multiple drafts of cover stories, show not confusion or impulse, but calculation. Your decision to wait over an hour before calling 911, which you admitted was to ensure your parents could not be revived, reveals a chilling detachment from the humanity of your victims, your own parents." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Judge Sanchez continued her sentencing remarks. "The Supreme Court has held that life without parole for juvenile offenders must be restricted to the rare cases where the crime reflects irreparable corruption rather than transient immaturity," she noted, "after careful consideration of all evidence presented at trial and today's hearing. This court finds that your crimes, Justin Westerfield, do indeed reflect such corruption." Judge Sanchez then delivered her sentence. "It is the judgment and sentence of this court that on each count of murder in the first degree you shall be committed to the Missouri Department of Corrections for the term of your natural life without the possibility of parole. These sentences shall run consecutively." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom despite the widely anticipated nature of this maximum sentence. Judge Sanchez added one final unusual comment. "Mr. Westerfield, you titled your journal Freedom Project. The profound irony is that your actions in pursuit of what you perceived as freedom have resulted in its permanent loss. That is not this court's doing. It is the natural consequence of your own calculated choices. The sentencing of 14-year-old Justin Westerfield to life without parole generated immediate legal and public controversy that extended far beyond Kansas City. Juvenile justice reform advocates denounced the sentence as constitutionally suspect, arguing that recent Supreme Court precedents had created a presumption against such sentences for juvenile offenders. Legal scholars debated whether Justin Westerfield's case truly represented the rare juvenile offender exception that the Supreme Court had carved out for life without parole sentences. The Westerfield case presents a perfect storm of factors that test the boundaries of juvenile justice reform, noted constitutional law professor Diane Fujimoto in a widely circulated analysis. On one hand, we have a very young offender whose brain is undeniably still developing. On the other hand, we have extraordinary evidence of premeditation, a complete lack of remorse, and victims who were the defendant's own parents, specifically targeted for their attempts to provide appropriate structure and guidance. The Missouri Innocence Project and several juvenile justice organizations filed amicus briefs supporting the defense's immediate appeal of the sentence, arguing that life without parole for a 14-year-old violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment regardless of the crime's severity. Conversely, law enforcement associations and victims' rights groups filed briefs supporting the sentence, arguing that the calculated nature of the murders, particularly evidenced by the ammunition purchase weeks before the killings, justified the maximum penalty available under law. Legal experts predicted that the Westerfield case would likely make its way to the Supreme Court eventually, potentially becoming a landmark decision on the limits of juvenile sentencing in particularly heinous cases. Beyond the legal debates, the Westerfield case sparked broader social conversations about parenting, adolescent mental health, and warning signs of potential violence. Schools across Missouri and beyond developed new protocols for responding to concerning statements from students, directly inspired by Justin's comment to his school counselor about making his parents disappear that had been interpreted as typical teenage hyperbole rather than a genuine threat. Mental health professionals pointed to the case as evidence of the need for better assessment tools to distinguish between normal adolescent boundary testing and more dangerous patterns of entitlement and lack of empathy. The Westerfield case represents a perfect storm of missed opportunities for intervention, observed child psychologist Dr. Hannah Rivera. A teenager expressing fantasies about his parents' deaths, researching inheritance law, creating fake IDs, these are not typical adolescent behaviors, and yet each individual warning sign was minimized or normalized until it was too late. The case had a profound impact on Kansas City's law enforcement and social services communities, where James and Emily Westerfield had been respected colleagues. The Kansas City Police Department established the James Westerfield Memorial Scholarship to support the children of officers pursuing careers in public service, while Jackson County Family Services created the Emily Westerfield Fund to provide emergency assistance to children in the foster care system. Annual memorial services on the anniversary of the Westerfield's deaths became community events that brought together police officers, social workers, and family members in a unique display of cross-professional solidarity. James and Emily represented the best kind of partnership between law enforcement and social services, noted Kansas City Mayor Regina Thompson at the first anniversary memorial. They understood that true community safety requires both the protection of the law and the support of social welfare systems. Their legacy lives on in the improved cooperation between these vital services. Heartland Hunting Supplies, the store where Justin had purchased the ammunition used in the murders, instituted comprehensive policy changes that were subsequently adopted by sporting goods retailers across the region. The Westerfield Protocol, as it became known in the industry, included mandatory digital verification of IDs for all ammunition purchases, regardless of the customer's apparent age, and required dual employee authorization for sales of certain calibers of ammunition. We never want another tragedy like the Westerfield murders to be enabled by ammunition purchased at any of our stores, Victor Ramirez stated when announcing the new policies. If these protocols had been in place on March 17, 2022, Justin Westerfield's fake ID would have been flagged immediately through digital verification, potentially preventing these murders. The Westerfield case thus catalyzed industry-wide improvements in ammunition sales security that experts credited with preventing numerous potential instances of fraud and straw purchasing in subsequent years. 5 years after the murders, in April 2027, the Supreme Court declined to hear Justin Westerfield's final appeal, effectively upholding his life without parole sentence and establishing a significant precedent for similar cases involving juveniles who commit premeditated murder. Writing for the majority in denying certiorari, Justice Eleanor Rodriguez noted, "While this court has indeed restricted the application of life without parole for juvenile offenders, we have never categorically prohibited such sentences in extraordinary cases that demonstrate irreparable corruption." The Westerfield case, with its exceptional evidence of premeditation including the ammunition purchase weeks before the murders, falls within this narrow exception. This ruling effectively created what legal scholars termed the Westerfield standard for evaluating when juvenile life without parole sentences might be constitutionally permissible, requiring clear evidence of extended planning and premeditation rather than impulsive action. The Westerfield family's tragedy continued to reverberate through their extended family in complex ways that defied simple healing narratives. Martha and Richard Barnett, Emily's parents, became advocates for both improved mental health screening for adolescents and stronger restrictions on ammunition sales, testifying before congressional committees about the devastating impact of their dual loss, their daughter to murder, and their grandson to imprisonment. We live in the impossible space between grieving our daughter and still loving the grandson who took her from us, Martha Barnett explained in a nationally televised interview on the 10th anniversary of the murders. We have not visited Justin in prison. That is a boundary we've established for our own survival, but we do exchange letters, and we pray for his soul. This nuanced perspective on their relationship with Justin reflected the complicated grief experienced by many families of juvenile offenders, particularly in cases where the victims and perpetrator share blood ties. James Westerfield's younger brother, Michael, who followed his brother into law enforcement after the murders, perhaps best articulated the lasting questions raised by the case during a memorial service marking the 10th anniversary of the Westerfield murders in 2032. A decade later, we still don't have satisfying answers to why this happened, Officer Michael Westerfield reflected. We know how the planning, the ammunition purchase, the execution of the plan on Easter morning, but the why remains elusive in any way that makes sense to a normal moral compass. How does a child raised with love, structure, and every advantage decide that murdering his parents is an acceptable solution to normal teenage restrictions? That's the question that haunts not just our family, but society as a whole. This fundamental question, how ordinary parental boundaries could trigger such an extraordinary and violent response, remained the most disturbing aspect of the Westerfield case, a sobering reminder that even in seemingly stable families, unseen psychological currents can sometimes lead to unimaginable tragedy. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Westerfield case was its impact on how the criminal justice system balances accountability and age in juvenile murder cases. The ammunition purchase that had formed the foundational evidence of premeditation became a benchmark in subsequent cases, a standard against which other juveniles' planning and intent were measured when determining appropriate charges and sentencing. As one judicial scholar noted in a comprehensive analysis published on the 15th anniversary of the murders, the Westerfield case fundamentally altered how courts evaluate juvenile intent in homicide cases. Before Westerfield, courts often presumed diminished capacity based solely on age. After Westerfield, courts look more carefully for specific evidence of planning and premeditation, recognizing that chronological age alone may not determine a juvenile's capacity for calculation and moral understanding. This more nuanced approach to juvenile justice, neither automatically leniently nor reflexively punitive, became known as the Westerfield Doctrine in legal education, a complex legacy for a case that began with a teenager's fateful decision to purchase ammunition for his father's hunting rifle, setting in motion a tragedy that would forever change his life, end his parents' lives, and leave an indelible mark on the American legal landscape.